Welcome to Stanford Legal, where we talk about the cases, questions, conflicts, and legal stories that affect us all every day. I'm Pam Carlin, along with Joe Bankman. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Pam. Pam, today we're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, tax. And we're going to talk about government benefits in part. There are a lot of great programs that really can help the poor. The problem is the paperwork to get benefits is so complicated that people don't do it.
Well, one of the Democratic candidates for president, Andrew Yang, has an answer, which is just get rid of all the complexity and send people a check.
And today we're going to talk about how to get government benefits in the hands of those who need them, including candidate Yang's proposal.
And we'll also be talking a little bit about Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax, won't we? Sort of the other end of the spectrum.
Absolutely. And our guest today is going to be our own Jacob Golden. Jacob's a colleague of ours at the law school. He's a lawyer and a PhD in economics and a colleague of mine in our small but together tax department here. Welcome, Jacob.
Thanks for having me.
And our other guest today, Joe, is going to be, it's going to be you. Joe is, in addition to everything else that our regular listeners know about, which is that he's a clinical psychologist, he's also a tax professor. And Joe has been involved in some really innovative work on taxes, both academic work and an attempt to make taxes easier for people to file. So welcome, Joe.
Well, thank you, Pam. I hope I'm a worthy guest.
And you get to keep your mug as a guest of our show.
And we're going to start, Jacob, talking about the problem of government benefits. And can you give us an example of just what that problem is?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. The problem is basically like you outlined. There are benefits like the earned income tax credit is a nice tax one that I study, that are designed to get lower income people, the resources they need to, improve their lives and to create different incentives. But a lot of the people who qualify for it don't end up getting any of the benefits. They either don't file their taxes at all, right, as part of your taxes, so they don't file a tax return at all, or they might file a tax return and not claim the benefit, or they might something else goes wrong in the process.
So what is a tax credit exactly?
So a tax credit is anything basically. It's like a gift card you would have at a store, like a Target. So you would have your final bill at the end of the day. You give them your gift card, they'd reduce your bill. So same thing for a tax credit. After you figure out how much taxes you owe, you figure out if you qualify for any of these tax credits, and you subtract that, and that's how much less you owe on your taxes.
But the great thing about the earned income tax credit is you can actually get money back. So it's not like the gift card where you hand it in and you have less on the gift card.
Right, exactly. So it's what's known as a refundable tax credit. And like you mentioned, so the idea is if you have more on the gift card than you have on your bill, right, the analogy would be the store would just like hand you a check for the difference. So same thing with the refundable tax credit. The government actually sends you a check. And from your perspective, it's exactly the same as if your employer had withheld too much from your paycheck during the year. Just translates into a bigger refund when you file your tax return.
And so is part of the problem here that people who think, well, I'm not going to get a refund, don't understand that even if you wouldn't kind of technically get a refund of taxes you'd already paid, you'd get the earned income tax credit sent back to you?
Could be some of that. A frustrating thing about this is even though we spend so much money on the benefits themselves, we don't really spend enough investing in the data and sort of analysis side of things to understand sort of where the shortcomings are when people aren't claiming them. So it's pretty tricky to figure out who is eligible for the credit but not actually claiming it on any sort of like systematic scale. When you like call people up when you're the IRS and call people up, they often don't want to talk to you, surprisingly.
And sometimes you're not even really the IRS when you call the people up. So beware of scams, listeners.
And the IRS doesn't even call people, it turns out. This is one of their things they're worried about, when you suggest to them, well, just talk to people and see why they don't claim it. One of the big worries is, well, everyone knows the IRS doesn't call people, initiate phone calls, so they don't want to undermine that.
And one of the ways to think about this, Jacob, to pick up on what you're saying, is this is one of the biggest forms of support we give the poor, the working poor. It's maybe $75 billion a year. So if you think of those billions going out, then the question is, how much do we spend studying the program and making sure the right people get it? And of course, it's going to just be a sliver of a sliver of a sliver of that.
That's right. I mean, when you compare it to such a big program, it's easy to build the case that we could be doing a little more analysis. Now, that being said, it is one of the most studied, policies that we've had in the United States. And really, I guess the sort of distinction is really looking into where these barriers are that prevent people from claiming it if they're eligible. And a lot depends sort of on whether you think that's a good idea or not, sort of depends on why you think people aren't claiming it. So, traditionally economists would, who believe in total rationality, things like that, would say, well, if you're not claiming it, you probably just don't need the money, and maybe there's not a lot of return to telling people about it. And there's, it could be some of that what's going on. But the other possibility, and we have more and more evidence from, Joe, and from your psychology work, from behavioral economics and psychology, that people also make these mistakes when they have sort of too much going on in their lives, and something slips, and often it could be like claiming a credit or benefit where you're not sure how much you'll get back, so you don't necessarily try.
And what's a solution that you've looked at? I mean, one thought is, let's really explain the benefits to people.
Yeah. That's sort of a natural starting point. Maybe people don't know about it. A problem with that is, in practice, a lot of people don't really, policymakers talk about the earned income tax credit as its own thing. When people, taxpayers in the real world think about this, they just think about their refund, and they don't differentiate between all the names of the child tax credit over withholding, the saver's credit. There's a lot, there's a whole sort of alphabet soup of acronyms of different tax credits. And so often if you ask people or just tell people about the earned income tax credit, that's kind of meaningless to them. I brought a prop. I didn't know if I was allowed to do that on the radio, but it's a postcard I got from Stanford in the mail, and it's called the Annual Earned Income Tax Credit Notification, and I think we all get one of these.
Even as a junior professor, I don't think you're eligible for this.
Yeah, they've really, Well, they're California doesn't
Not
really
quite
want to be
low income enough.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
California wants to play it safe, and they basically require all employers to send these notifications to all employees, and they just tell people about the earned income tax credit. And California's is okay. Some states there's a federal form that's like 2 pages, very complicated, and you might imagine these things don't work. So a lot of states require these. A growing number of states are requiring these notifications, and it doesn't. From what we could tell, looking at the studying the data, there's no evidence that they actually do anything.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking with our colleague Jacob Golden and also our guest/colleague Joe Bankman about taxes. And Joe, you've also worked on this idea of trying to simplify people's interaction with the government over their taxes.
Yeah, the question is, can we make filing simpler? And I would let Jacob answer on his own research, but I'm going to give it away. One of the things Jacob's research, I think, has shown is that those cards that tell us in mind-numbing detail that we have something coming don't work. What works is to get people to file their taxes, and we have to make that easier. And so Jacob's found that, I think, with respect to government benefits, that the best thing we can do is get people to a tax preparer.
That's right. So getting people, when we look at policies that basically get people to file their taxes, the way we do things now, where people either go to a preparer and the preparer uses some sort of software, or even when people do it themselves with some sort of software like TurboTax or H&R Block, if they're filing their taxes, they're usually going to end up getting the benefits that they qualify for. So really the key, like Joe said, is to make it easy for them to do that. And the question is then, how do you make it easy? And there's some studies for things like the earned income tax credit, where when the IRS sends a form to people who look like they're going to qualify for the credit, and it's basically just a checklist that the person has to fill out, that works pretty well. A lot of people then claim the credit because of that.
Yeah, and Joe, do you want to say anything about your ideas on ReadyReturn and how that's connected?
Well, what Jacob is pointing out is for some taxpayers, we have a pretty good idea they qualify for the credit. We have a lot of wage data for them. We know they're not making very much money. So we can start the ball rolling, as it were, by saying, hey, here's what your employer seems to have paid you last year. If that's true, why don't you fill this out and get a credit? We could do that same thing for a lot of taxpayers because the government has all that data on us, including wealthy taxpayers that have mortgage payments that they make and interest income and stocks and bonds that are producing income. Government already knows that. So why can't it start the ball rolling by giving you or your preparer access to that?
And yet we don't do that. We actually make it kind of hard.
No, we
for
don't
people.
do it. And one of the hopes I have is that we could at least do it for the group that Jacob is studying it, which are the poor, since one of the reasons we don't do it from the other groups is opposition of the tax preparation industry. That's not, I think, a significant force with people that are getting the earned income tax credit.
Well, it's probably a different part of the tax preparation industry. I mean, so there's lots of studies that find that tax preparers disproportionately locate in low-income neighborhoods. Why is that? It's not sort of necessarily just an altruistic desire to make sort of tax filing easier for lower-income people. It's that when people get big refunds from things like the earned income tax credit, they're willing to fork over more of that refund to the tax preparers.
And they do it in some ways almost as a kind of like almost the equivalent of payday loans, right? You get a loan from the tax preparer that's based on your refund. And if you could just wait a little longer, if you weren't quite as pressed, you'd get the whole amount from the government.
Yeah, historically, these were one of the big sort of like profit drivers for these tax preparation companies, where you'd give a refund to, in advance, even before the return was filed and processed. There was some regulatory backlash, and the tax preparation companies really backed off of that. Although we've seen them come back in the last year or two, sometimes with lower fees, just often as a way to get taxpayers in the door, because even without that, it's still so profitable to do these returns.
So we've talked about simplifying filing, Jacob, and getting the poor to a tax preparer. How about candidate Yang's proposal? I mean, it won't be a problem of filing for an earned income tax credit. We're going to give you the money to start with.
So this is Stanford Legal, and we're talking with our colleague Jacob Golden about taxing. So Jacob, what about the Yang proposal?
Well, and remind me, it's the freedom
bonus.
The freedom bonus.
I think what it's called, $1,000 a month, and then we can get rid of a lot of specific programs. Everybody's going to get the cash.
Well, and I think a lot turns on what we do with these other programs. Do we think of it as a substitute for things like the Earned Income Tax Credit, for SNAP, sort of the modern version of food stamps, for TANF, the sort of modern version of welfare? Or is it sort of on top of all these other programs? And I think a lot turns on those sort of questions. But I think you're right that a part that hasn't been explored very much is maybe this benefit that if we're just sending a check to everyone, we don't have to worry about take-up as much. Everyone's going to know they qualify.
So is it a check per person, or is it a check per family, or what's the...
The proposal is a check per person.
So a kind of family of three, a mother with 2 children would be getting
I don't know if there's an
$3,000
age limit, so I don't know if your newborn gets the check, but it might be everyone over 18.
And I think that's a great point, though, because a lot of what's hard for things like the Earned Income Tax Credit to figure out your eligibility is about the eligibility for kids. And so we have all these, in the tax context, we have rules about which kids can be claimed by which parents. We have tiebreaker rules that come into play when different family members claim kids. And if, assuming that each kid is only going to qualify one adult, each kid's check is only going to go to one household, we're going to need to have so you can't just have the government sending out the checks. They're going to need to figure out where the kids live. And so maybe you're going to need to have to deal with these sort of administrative questions there as well. I don't think there's been much attention to that so far.
So you're going to have some administrative expense and complexity because the government has to know how many people in your household, for example. How about the rest of it? When you hear these proposals, what are you thinking of upsides, downsides?
Well, as you sort of alluded to before, maybe Pam alluded to, a lot depends on what we're doing alongside with them. So how we're funding them. You mentioned the sort of Warren proposals for a wealth tax. I think if we're funding them with a wealth tax versus not funding them or using something like the reducing other benefit programs, I think that affects things a lot. But sort of setting the funding aside for a moment, a lot, if we're sort of comparing it to the earned income tax credit that we have now, a lot depends on the incentives that they generate. So the earned income tax credit, one of the big defining features of the earned income tax credit, as opposed to sort of other types of income support programs, is that at least for a lot of people, as you earn more in income, your benefit actually goes up, right? Historically, for welfare, as you earn more, your benefit goes down. For the earned income tax credit, for the lowest income people, as you earn more, your benefit goes up.
So it encourages you to work more.
That's why Republicans like it. That's one of the big reasons why it has such bipartisan appeal. And that is good if you want people to work, and there's lots of reasons to think that that's important for people. If you care about people having sort of independence, if you care about, there's a lot of reasons to think that people working is good for communities. One of the downsides is that if you're really low income or you really have no income for the year, then you don't benefit from things like the earned income tax credit. You get no benefit. And so that's one of the potential benefits of a program like UBI is you would be funneling money to that very, very low income group that would be getting a small benefit under the earned income tax credit.
So UBI is universal basic income, right?
That's right.
The
freedom bonus.
The other name
I'm sorry.
for the freedom bonus.
Yeah.
That's right. And so one of the consequences, Jacob, of these UBI, the freedom bonuses, is you probably get a little less labor effort than you would with an earned income tax credit because you're not encouraging work. You're not reducing it as people get wealthier. So it's not like traditional welfare, which has a bigger deleterious effect, but you're paying people and then a little bit not encouraging them to work, reducing the desperation to work, maybe.
I think I think that's very possible that you would get that. A lot, I think, would probably hinge on how it gets funded. So let's say you give everybody a bonus, and you got to pay for it somehow, and so you pay for it by raising the income tax rate. Well, now when the income tax rate is higher, there's a less of an incentive to work from that reason. So maybe you have so these are sort of offsetting effects potentially.
We'll be back with more from our guest, Jacob Golden, talking about taxation next on Stanford Legal here on Sirius XM. Welcome back to Stanford Legal, where we talk about the cases, questions, conflicts, and legal stories that affect us all every day. I'm Pam Carlin, along with Joe Bankman.
And we're here with Jacob Golden, and we're discussing at the moment candidate Andrew Yang's freedom bonus, $1,000 for every adult, as I understand it. And one of the questions is, who pays for it? And I guess the answer, this is from the candidate's website, is it's going to be paid for largely by a VAT. That is a new value-added tax of 10% on all goods and services.
Is a VAT basically a sales tax, Joe?
Yes.
Good, because you go to Europe if you're lucky enough to go to Europe, and there's a VAT on everything, and you can get it back. But we don't have a national sales tax.
We don't have it, and one way to think about a VAT is we're just adding, I suppose, a 10% tax on all consumption purchases.
And when we think of taxes, oftentimes people talk about progressive taxes versus regressive taxes, and that's not a left-right distinction. It's a different kind of distinction. I wonder if you could kind of explain that to our listeners.
Well, people talk about a progressive tax as one where the burden of the tax, sort of the cost of paying the tax, goes up more as you get richer. So something like a sales tax is one that we normally think of as pretty regressive. The opposite of this, right, where the burden is higher on lower income people.
Because they spend more of their money and they don't save as much of the money.
Exactly.
Yeah. as opposed to like the graduated income tax, where if you make $30,000 a year, you pay X percent, but if you make $100,000 a year, you pay X plus Y percent.
That's on paper. That's exactly right. Now, when you teach this stuff, as I've learned the last couple of years, it's hard not to get like a little bit radicalized on sort of the difference between the sort of basic progressive increasing graduated income tax rates that we have on the one hand, and then sort of the realities about which types of income actually get taxed on the other, and sort of the how easy it is for people whose income comes from wealth, for example, to avoid taxes on that sort of thing.
And when we talk about the VAT, then we have a regressive tax funding what looks to be a pretty progressive proposal, but with an odd twist. We're paying everybody $1,000. That's going to be much more important a month. That's more important to a poor person than a wealthy person, but the wealthy person still gets it. Bill Gates would still get his freedom dividend.
That's right, and I mean a little bit. That's on the one hand, like you mentioned earlier, that's one of the nice features of UBI like policy, where by not clawing it back as you get higher and higher income, you're not generating this disincentive to work, right? You're not making it less worthwhile for people to earn extra income. Now, whether we think that's so important for affecting how much the really rich people will actually work or not, some people, different experts go different ways.
I mean, isn't the real reason to do it that way the same reason why we give everybody Social Security when they get old, even if they don't need it, is that builds popular support for the program. If everybody's getting it, they're more likely to support it than if you say, we're going to have a program to give $1,000 a month to other people, but not to you.
The freedom bonus for everyone, not for some.
That's right.
That's right, although some of the people that are getting it will also be paying for it as well.
Well, somebody's going to have to pay for it because there's no such thing as a free lunch.
How about a wealth tax, Jacob? That's something you mentioned. Elizabeth Warren's favored it. How do we think about that?
Well, it's another way it's one of those. If we really have a program that's giving $12,000 per year to every individual, that adds up quickly. And a wealth tax is an area of pretty untapped. It's not something that we tax right now at the federal level.
So what is a wealth tax?
So a wealth tax is it's a tax based on the total wealth somebody has. So as opposed to an income tax, which is based on changes in their wealth or purchasing power from year to year, things like their assets going up in value, their stocks going up in value, or they're getting paid a salary. Though the wealth tax is based on the total amount of wealth that they have at any point in time.
So it's a kind of version of the estate tax, but for people who are still alive. It's like a life tax as opposed to a death tax.
Yeah.
Well, I feel good about that. And this is Stanford Legal. We're talking today with our colleague Jacob Golden about taxation. Joe?
And the wealth tax that we're talking about, I take it, Jacob, the advantage is the income tax isn't getting at some forms of wealth. So someone like Larry Ellison might have billions and billions of dollars of wealth, but has relatively little income, and he can borrow off that wealth and fund his consumption tax-free. So the wealth tax might help us get around that and get at some of that wealth.
That's right. The big hole in the income tax right now, and the thing that makes it much more regressive than the sort of formally progressive rates would suggest, is this idea that what's sort of the technical name for this is that it's a tax when there's a realization event. But really what that means is that if somebody has stock, the stock goes up in value over the course of the year. They don't owe tax on that stock, that increase in value, until they actually sell the stock. And so for people who have lots of wealth in the form of assets that they're not selling year to year, a lot of that income, a lot of their change in wealth is not actually ever getting taxed. And then and through sort of another provision, it actually might never get taxed if they pass it on to their heirs when they die.
So this would be a way to get at the tax of some of our billionaires. I didn't identify Larry Ellison. He's the founder of Oracle. Probably most of our listeners and viewers know that. So it's a way to get at those extremes of wealth. What's the downside to it?
Well, one of the traditional complaints against the wealth tax is that it'd be hard to value. So, maybe it's not so hard to tell if your publicly traded stock changes in value from one year to the other. But for something like a famous painting, a painting that you have, it's hard to maybe for the IRS to track the market price of that from year to year. Now, there's ways around that in valuation techniques, but it's a headache. Another argument could be sort of a liquidity concern. So, we don't want to force people to sell their assets before they're ready to do so in order to pay the tax. That's another big problem. And then the other practical problem, and, I'm turning to Pam now because this is really
because I'm the practical one here.
Well,
I guess.
and the constitutional one. So there's a lot less certainty over whether a wealth tax would be constitutional than it really hasn't been tested in recent history in the U.S.
And it's hard to know exactly where the line between wealth and income is in the way things get characterized. I mean, if you think about, there's certain forms of income, it's absolutely clear they're income, and then there are other forms of money moving around where it's not entirely even clear it's income.
Well said, Ann. Well said.
That's because I'm the practical one.
And what do you think on the constitutionality, Jacob? Is there a way to make it work or not? Well, this is kind of a thumbs up, thumbs down.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not like there's it's going to come down to sort of a judgment call by the Supreme Court, like so many of these things. And if you're sort of betting on the political winds and sort of the current makeup of the court, you might be reluctant. I guess they'd probably go against something that was really called a wealth tax, but you might have more luck if you're trying to go that direction, designing a very similar policy that taxes income, right? It is a fine line, and I think that would have a much better chance of being upheld as constitutional.
So the answer is maybe if done indirectly. We've been talking here with my colleague Jacob Golden about how to get benefits to the people who need them the most. Jacob's done some terrific work showing, for example, that we should quit trying to explain benefits which we don't understand ourselves for the most part, meaning the average person, and just get the poor to a tax preparer for some of the benefits who can help them get those benefits. We've been talking about some of the more imaginative and far-reaching proposals of Democratic challengers that we've heard in the recent debate. Andrew Yang's freedom bonus, a form of universal basic income, and Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax. And if either of them becomes a nominee, Jacob, I bet we'll have plenty of time to talk more about those two subjects.
Great.
So thanks, Jacob, for joining us, and thanks to our listeners for joining us on Stanford Legal here on Sirius XM Insight 121.